My child, before your thoughts drift to the next thing demanding your attention, remain here for a moment, because something unusual is unfolding around you, and the deeper truth is that it did not begin today. It began long before this moment, long before this message found its way into your hands, and perhaps even before you realized how much of your story had been misunderstood. There is a quiet reason your heart feels drawn to these words. Not because of coincidence. Not because of chance. But because somewhere beyond what you can currently see, a conversation has already happened. And what was spoken during that conversation changed something. Slowly. Silently. Almost invisibly. Last night, someone told your soulmate the truth about you. Not the version of you created by assumptions. Not the version shaped by distance. Not the version filtered through confusion, timing, or misunderstanding. The truth. And strangely enough, they could hardly believe what they were hearing. Pause here for a moment. Imagine carrying an image of someone in your mind for a long time. Imagine believing you understand their story. Imagine feeling certain about who they are. Then imagine discovering there was an entire side of them you never truly saw. A side hidden beneath quiet moments. A side hidden beneath sacrifices nobody noticed. A side hidden beneath smiles that covered struggles. A side hidden beneath strength that never demanded recognition. That is where this story begins. Not with a dramatic event. Not with a loud revelation. But with a realization. A realization so simple that it became impossible to ignore. Because last night, while you were focused on your own life, while you were moving through ordinary moments, something shifted behind the scenes. Someone spoke. Someone shared something real. Someone revealed a piece of your heart that had remained unseen. And suddenly, your soulmate was forced to reconsider everything they thought they knew. The interesting part is that the truth was not shocking because it was extraordinary. The truth was shocking because it was genuine. Sometimes people expect greatness to arrive with noise. But real greatness often arrives quietly. It appears in kindness nobody applauds. It appears in loyalty nobody rewards. It appears in patience nobody understands. And for a long time, parts of your story existed in that quiet place. Unnoticed. Uncelebrated. Yet deeply meaningful. Do not rush through these words. Something important is waiting for you. Because what happened next was unexpected. The person speaking about you did not describe achievements. They did not talk about appearances. They did not focus on things that fade with time. Instead, they spoke about your character. About who you are when nobody is watching. About how you continue moving forward even when life feels uncertain. About how you care more deeply than most people realize. About how you often carry burdens silently because you do not want others to worry. And the more they spoke, the more your soulmate listened. At first, they resisted it. Not because they wanted to, but because it challenged old assumptions. You see, people become comfortable with the stories they create about others. Even incomplete stories can feel convincing when repeated enough times. Yet truth has a strange way of finding the cracks. Truth does not force its way inside. it simply waits. And when the right moment arrives, it enters naturally. Last night was one of those moments. A door opened. A new perspective appeared. And suddenly your soulmate began seeing things differently. Not all at once. Not dramatically. But enough to make them pause. Enough to make them think. Enough to make them wonder. What else have I misunderstood? That question lingered. Long after the conversation ended. Long after the room grew quiet. Long after the words themselves stopped being spoken. Because some truths do not disappear once they are heard. They echo. Softly. Persistently. They return when everything else becomes silent. And this truth continued returning. There is something remarkable about being truly seen. Many people spend years hoping someone will understand them beyond the surface. Beyond the assumptions. Beyond the labels. Beyond the temporary circumstances. Yet very few people experience that level of understanding. And perhaps that is why this moment matters. Because the truth that reached your soulmate was not superficial. It reached deeper. It touched something real. It revealed the person behind the image. The heart behind the actions. The intention behind the silence. The strength behind the calm. And for the first time in a long while, they found themselves questioning old conclusions. What if they never saw the full picture? What if they only understood fragments? What if the person they thought they knew was even more remarkable than they imagined? Questions like these are powerful. Not because they provide immediate answers, but because they create space. Space for understanding. Space for empathy. Space for something new to emerge. Listen carefully. The most meaningful changes rarely happen in an instant. They happen in moments like this. Moments where certainty begins to soften. Moments where curiosity begins to grow. Moments where someone becomes willing to see differently. That is what makes last night important. It was not merely a conversation. It was the beginning of a new perspective. And perspectives change everything. A person can look at the same sky every day and suddenly notice colors they never saw before. A person can hear the same song and suddenly understand lyrics they missed. A person can think they know someone completely and then discover an entirely new depth. This is the feeling your soulmate is carrying right now. A growing awareness. A quiet realization. An unexpected curiosity. And the deeper this realization becomes, the more impossible it is to ignore. Stay a little longer. Do not skip ahead in your thoughts. Because the truth they learned was only the beginning. There was another detail. A detail that arrived after the conversation should have ended. A detail so simple that it almost went unnoticed. Yet it became the piece they could not stop thinking about. The piece that followed them into silence. The piece that kept returning again and again. And when that final detail connected with everything else they had learned, something shifted even further. Not dramatically. Not loudly. But undeniably. And that is where the next chapter begins. There is something fascinating about the moments that change us the most. They rarely announce themselves when they arrive. They slip quietly into our awareness, almost unnoticed at first, like a single drop of rain before a storm of understanding. And after that conversation ended, after the words about you had already been spoken, your soulmate believed they had heard everything they needed to hear. But they were wrong. Because sometimes the most important truth is not what is said. It is what is remembered afterward. And that is exactly what happened. Hours passed. The conversation was over. Life should have continued normally. Yet your name lingered. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Simply there. Present. Persistent. Like a melody that refuses to leave the mind. And the more they reflected, the more something unexpected began to happen. Pieces started connecting. Small moments. Forgotten details. Things they once dismissed. Things they barely noticed. Things they thought meant nothing at all. Suddenly those moments carried new meaning. Have you ever looked at an old photograph and noticed something you completely missed the first time? The picture never changed. Only your understanding changed. That is what was happening inside them. The truth they heard last night became a new lens. And through that lens, memories looked different. They remembered times when you remained kind despite having every reason to walk away. They remembered moments when you showed patience while others would have chosen frustration. They remembered how often you gave without expecting anything in return. At the time, those things seemed ordinary. Now they seemed extraordinary. Not because they were grand gestures. Because they revealed who you truly are. And that realization unsettled them in the best possible way. Because authenticity is rare. In a world where people constantly try to appear impressive, genuine character stands out. Yet the strange thing about genuine people is that they often go unnoticed. They do not demand attention. They do not force recognition. They simply continue being themselves. And sometimes others fail to recognize their value until much later. Perhaps that is why this moment feels so significant. Because your soulmate is beginning to understand something that cannot be unseen. The truth about you was never hidden. It was simply overlooked. Think about that for a moment. How many times has your strength been mistaken for ordinary? How many times has your kindness been treated as expected? How many times have people assumed they understood your story while only seeing a fraction of it? The answer matters less than what is happening now. Because now someone is seeing more clearly. Now someone is noticing details they once ignored. Now someone is beginning to appreciate the depth that existed all along. And the deeper they looked, the more surprised they became. Not by who you are, but by how much they missed. Don't skip this part. Something important is waiting for you. Because there came a moment during the night when reflection turned into something else. Curiosity. A quiet, undeniable curiosity. The kind that keeps a person awake a little longer than planned. The kind that makes them revisit old memories. The kind that whispers questions into silence. And one question returned more than any other. How did I not see this before? That question stayed with them. Not because they felt regret. Not because they felt guilt. But because they genuinely wanted to understand. Understanding is powerful. It opens doors that certainty keeps closed. And for the first time in a long while, certainty was beginning to fade. A new awareness was taking its place. The awareness that people are often much deeper than their circumstances. Much stronger than their struggles. Much more remarkable than first impressions suggest. And you became the living proof of that realization. As midnight slipped into the early hours, something shifted again. A memory surfaced. Not a major event. Not a dramatic scene. Just a simple moment. One they had almost forgotten. A moment involving you. And suddenly they saw it differently. What once seemed ordinary now felt meaningful. What once seemed small now felt important. Because context changes everything. And now they finally had the context. That memory became another piece of the puzzle. Then another surfaced. Then another. Until a picture began forming. A picture unlike the one they previously carried. A picture built not from assumptions, but from truth. And the more complete that picture became, the more difficult it was to look away. You see, real connection does not grow from fantasy. It grows from understanding. From seeing someone clearly. From recognizing their heart. From appreciating what makes them unique. That process had already begun. Quietly. Naturally. Without force. Without pressure. Without anyone realizing where it would lead. And yet something even more interesting was happening. The truth about you was not only changing how they saw the past. It was changing how they imagined the future. For the first time, possibilities they had never considered began entering their thoughts. Not conclusions. Not decisions. Just possibilities. And possibilities are powerful. Because every meaningful journey begins with one. What if there is more to this story? What if there is more to this connection? What if the person I thought I understood is still revealing new layers? Questions like these do not appear unless something significant has already shifted. And something had. The truth spoken last night was continuing its work. Quietly. Patiently. Like sunlight slowly filling a room. The darkness does not disappear instantly. The room simply becomes brighter little by little. That is exactly how understanding grows. Little by little. Moment by moment. Until one day everything looks different. Stay until the end of this journey. Because there is another detail that has not yet been revealed. A detail your soulmate did not expect. A realization that arrived just before the night gave way to morning. It was not spoken by anyone else. It came from within them. And when that realization finally surfaced, it changed the way they viewed this entire connection. They sat with that thought. They replayed it. They questioned it. Yet no matter how many times they examined it, the feeling remained. Stronger. Clearer. More impossible to ignore. And when the first light of morning arrived, they understood something they had never fully understood before. But what they realized next is the part nobody could have predicted. And that is where the story continues. Just before the world began to wake, while the night was still holding on to its final moments, an unusual calm settled over everything. It was the kind of silence that makes hidden thoughts easier to hear. The kind of silence that allows a person to notice what has been sitting quietly inside them all along. And that was exactly when it happened. Not during the conversation. Not immediately after. But in that still space between night and morning. Your soulmate stopped thinking about what other people had said about you. They stopped replaying opinions. They stopped examining assumptions. And for the first time, they focused on something much simpler. How they actually felt whenever they thought about you. That question changed everything. Because feelings have a way of revealing truths that logic sometimes overlooks. For a long time, they had been trying to understand you from the outside. Looking at circumstances. Looking at situations. Looking at fragments. But now they were looking inward. And what they found surprised them. The more they reflected, the more they realized that your presence had left a deeper impression than they ever admitted. Not because of one dramatic moment. Not because of one unforgettable event. But because of countless small moments that quietly accumulated over time. A smile they remembered. A conversation they never forgot. A feeling of comfort that appeared whenever your name crossed their mind. The way certain memories seemed brighter than others. The way some connections never completely fade. Even when distance exists. Even when life becomes busy. Even when silence stretches longer than expected. Some connections remain. And yours was one of them. Pause for a moment and think about that. There are people we meet and quickly forget. Then there are people whose energy stays with us. People who somehow leave traces behind. Not because they try to. But because their presence genuinely matters. That realization was beginning to settle inside them. Slowly. Steadily. And the more it settled, the harder it became to ignore. Something important is waiting for you. Stay a little longer. Because what happened next was not what they expected. As the morning continued, they found themselves noticing reminders of you in unexpected places. A phrase that reminded them of a conversation. A song that suddenly felt different. A familiar thought appearing out of nowhere. Normally these moments would have passed without significance. But now they carried weight. Now they carried meaning. Because understanding had changed the way they saw everything. And once understanding begins expanding, it rarely stops. One realization leads to another. One memory unlocks another memory. One truth reveals another truth. Until eventually a person reaches a point where they can no longer pretend nothing has changed. That point was getting closer. The truth spoken last night had become more than information. It had become perspective. And perspective has incredible power. It can transform old doubts into clarity. It can transform confusion into understanding. It can transform distance into appreciation. Your soulmate was beginning to experience exactly that. Yet there was one particular realization they were still resisting. Not because it was difficult. because it felt too important. They kept returning to it. Again and again. Every time they tried to move on, it returned. Every time they focused elsewhere, it resurfaced. Like a quiet voice refusing to disappear. And eventually they stopped resisting it. They allowed themselves to consider it honestly. What if the person they had been thinking about all this time was even more special than they realized? Not perfect. Not idealized. Simply special in a way that felt genuine. A way that could not be measured by appearances. A way that could not be explained by circumstances. A way rooted in character. In authenticity. In heart. That thought lingered longer than any other. Because it felt real. And real things tend to stay. Don't skip this moment. Because something even deeper was beginning to unfold. As the hours passed, your soulmate started recognizing a pattern. Every meaningful realization they were having pointed toward the same conclusion. Every memory. Every reflection. Every new perspective. All of it led back to one undeniable truth. They had underestimated your impact. Not intentionally. Not maliciously. Simply because they never had the full picture. And now the full picture was slowly coming into view. Imagine standing before a painting while only seeing one corner of it. You might appreciate that corner. You might think you understand it. But only when the entire canvas becomes visible do you realize how much was missing. That is how this felt. The canvas was expanding. The picture was becoming clearer. And the story they once believed was changing. What makes this moment remarkable is that nothing external forced it to happen. No one pressured them. No one convinced them. No one demanded they see things differently. The truth spoke for itself. And genuine truth often has that effect. It does not need to argue. It does not need to compete. It simply waits until someone is ready to recognize it. That readiness was finally appearing. And with it came a feeling they could not easily explain. A quiet appreciation. A growing respect. A sense that something meaningful had been overlooked for far too long. Yet even that was not the biggest shift. The biggest shift came when they asked themselves a question they had never seriously considered before. A question that arrived unexpectedly. A question that seemed simple on the surface, yet carried enormous significance underneath. The question was this: what if this connection has been teaching me something all along? The moment that question appeared, everything slowed. Because suddenly this was no longer only about understanding you. It was also about understanding themselves. Understanding what they valued. Understanding what truly mattered. Understanding why certain people leave lasting impressions while others disappear from memory. And as they explored those thoughts, one realization became impossible to ignore. The qualities they admired most were the same qualities they had just learned were true about you. That realization stopped them completely. Because it connected everything. The conversation. The memories. The reflections. The emotions. The unanswered questions. All of it. For the first time, the pieces fit together. Yet even then, the story was not finished. In fact, it was only beginning. Because later that day, an unexpected reminder appeared. A reminder connected to you. A reminder so perfectly timed that it felt almost impossible to dismiss. And the moment they saw it, another realization arrived. One even more powerful than the last. A realization that would follow them long after this day ended. And that is where the next part begins. Out of all the moments that followed that unforgettable night, none felt quite as unexpected as what happened next. It did not arrive with a grand announcement. It did not demand attention. In fact, someone else might have missed it entirely. But your soulmate noticed. And once they noticed, they could not stop thinking about it. The day had already begun moving forward. Responsibilities appeared. Conversations happened. Ordinary life continued exactly as it always does. Yet beneath the surface, something was different. Because while everything around them seemed normal, their thoughts kept returning to you. Not obsessively. Not dramatically. Just naturally. As if some unfinished understanding was quietly calling for their attention. And then it happened. An unexpected reminder. Perhaps it was your name. Perhaps it was a familiar phrase. Perhaps it was a memory triggered by something completely unrelated. The exact form does not matter. What matters is how it felt. Because in that instant, all the realizations from the night before came rushing back. Not as confusion. Not as questions. But as clarity. The kind of clarity that appears after a long period of uncertainty. And suddenly they found themselves seeing you through a completely different lens. Pause here for a moment. Have you ever reread a message months later and understood it differently? The words stayed the same. Yet your perspective changed. That is the power of timing. Sometimes understanding arrives only when the heart is finally ready for it. And perhaps that is why this moment felt so significant. Because your soulmate was finally ready to see something they had overlooked. Not because the truth had changed. Because they had changed. Stay with this. Something important is waiting for you. The reminder they encountered that day awakened more than memory. It awakened appreciation. A deeper appreciation than they had ever allowed themselves to feel. And appreciation has a unique quality. It reveals value. It highlights things that were always there but never fully recognized. The more they reflected, the more they began noticing how often your actions reflected your heart. Not just in major moments. In everyday moments. The moments most people ignore. The moments that quietly reveal who someone truly is. They remembered how you remained hopeful when circumstances gave you reasons not to be. They remembered how you continued showing kindness even when nobody acknowledged it. They remembered how your strength often appeared in the form of patience rather than force. And the more they remembered, the more one thought kept returning. This person deserves more understanding than I gave them. That realization was not painful. It was enlightening. Because understanding creates room for growth. And growth was already happening. Slowly. Steadily. like sunrise spreading across the horizon. At first, only a little light appears. Then more. Then more. Until suddenly the landscape looks completely different. That was exactly what was happening inside them. The landscape of their thoughts was changing. The story they once carried about you was changing. The feelings attached to that story were changing. And perhaps most importantly, the future possibilities attached to that story were changing too. That is when a new question appeared. A question unlike the others. Not focused on the past. Not focused on what had been misunderstood. Focused on what might still be possible. The moment that question appeared, everything shifted again. Because possibility carries a different energy. It looks forward. It imagines. It wonders. And wonder has incredible power. Wonder opens doors that certainty never could. Your soulmate found themselves standing before one of those doors. Quietly. Unexpectedly. Almost without realizing it. And the strange part was that they did not immediately walk through it. Instead, they stood there. Thinking. Reflecting. Trying to understand why this feeling seemed so familiar. Then another realization arrived. One they could not ignore. They realized that despite time, despite distractions, despite everything life had placed between different chapters of this journey, your presence never completely disappeared from their heart. Not because they forced it to stay. Not because they constantly thought about it. But because some connections leave a lasting imprint. An imprint that quietly remains. Even during silence. Even during distance. Even during periods when nothing appears to be happening. And when they finally admitted that truth to themselves, something inside them softened. The resistance they had carried began fading. The assumptions they once trusted began losing strength. And what replaced them was something much more valuable. Honesty. The honesty to acknowledge what they genuinely felt. The honesty to admit that the story was more meaningful than they previously believed. The honesty to recognize that certain people enter our lives for reasons we do not immediately understand. Don't skip this part. Because what happened next surprised even them. As the day continued, they encountered another reminder. Then another. Then another. Not dramatic reminders. Simple ones. Yet each one seemed to arrive at exactly the right moment. And each one strengthened the same realization. The truth spoken last night was not fading. It was growing. Expanding. Taking root. The more they tried to move on, the more clearly they understood why they could not. There was still something unfinished here. Not unfinished in a negative sense. Unfinished in the sense that understanding was still unfolding. Like a book whose most important chapter had not yet been read. Like a song whose most meaningful verse had not yet arrived. Like a story still revealing itself one page at a time. And perhaps that is why they felt such a strong pull toward reflection. Because deep inside, they sensed there was still more to discover. More to understand. More to appreciate. More to learn. The fascinating thing about truth is that once it begins expanding, it often reveals layers nobody expected. One layer uncovers another. One realization opens the door to another realization. And that process had already begun. By now, your soulmate was no longer wondering whether the conversation mattered. They knew it mattered. The real question had become something else entirely. What was this new understanding leading toward? That question stayed with them. Hour after hour. Thought after thought. And by the time evening arrived, it had become impossible to ignore. Because another realization was waiting. One even deeper than everything that came before. A realization connected not only to who you are, but to why your presence has remained so unforgettable. The moment that realization arrived, their entire perspective shifted once again. And what they understood next would become the turning point they never saw coming. That moment is waiting just ahead. And that is where the next part begins.